Hey everybody, welcome back to Choosers of the Slain, episode 7. I'm Nate.
I'm Luke.
And today we are bringing you a big announcement, which is us talking about the big announcement of 9th edition.
There's so much to say.
There is a lot to say, and we'll try and keep this episode, to a reasonable amount of time where you can watch it in at least a day. So why don't we get started? First off, they for 9th edition decided to name 9 big things that they thought the community would be excited about. So we'll just jump in on those and then talk about them after that.
Sounds good. I love what they did, that clever 9 things.
Yeah.
So, I'll start out here. So number 1, they're looking at polishing up the rules, kind of clearing up the language, adding extra examples, just making it clearer to understand, which I think is extremely helpful because there's a handful of rules in 8th edition that no matter how many times you explain them, somebody still struggles with them. Then the second thing that they wanted to discuss was Crusade, which is a new expansion to the narrative style of gameplay, allowing you to do like extended campaigns with experience points and battle scars, kind of escalation rules, that kind of stuff. The third thing they showed off was changing command points, which I think is a huge needed thing for the game. Switching to the size of the battle sets the number of command points for all players, as opposed to basing it on how many detachments you can cram into your army. Then number 4 was tanks. Games Workshop has recognized that Leman Russes are rendered useless by a grot. So they've updated the rules to allow tanks to fire out of close combat.
Certainly going to be some interesting changes there. But I think the big one is number 5. There are a lot of big ones, but I think the big one for us, especially if you've been listening since we started this, is number 5. Major changes to terrain and an expansion of the terrain rules. So
yes, thank you so much.
That there's a lot to go into there, but we can wax philosophic on that in a little while here.
Oh, indeed.
Beyond that, you heard Luke kind of mention the command points based on game size. They've also indicated that they're going to be working to balance the game at every size, as opposed to it just having kind of a good feeling point. So right now that point tends to be around 2,000 points that we see people play. But if you're playing smaller games, a lot of missions aren't tailored to that. A lot of armies don't play so well at, say 1,000 points compared to at 2,000 points, but others play better in smaller sizes. So I'm excited to see them change that. And kind of not necessarily related to point size, but related to some of the more tactical depth is changes to the strategic reserves rules and being able to put more stuff in reserve and kind of play around with that a little more. I'm always a fan of seeing more strategy get added to the pregame section of things and move on.
Indeed,
with that.
I'm really happy to see that come back instead of just requiring you to have deep strikeable units to do anything with reserves.
Yep, absolutely. Why don't you take our last 2 here, because there are another couple big ones.
Yes, couple really big ones. Blast weapons, which I think is going to hopefully be the sweet spot in between the folks who missed the blast templates and the folks who understand that the new system needed to speed things up a bit. They're introducing a new weapon type to the game that allows certain weapons to be more effective when fired at large groups of infantry. And then finally, flyers. They are basically fixing these. They are adding back into the game the ability for flyers to leave the airspace of the table and return back onto the table later, as opposed to removing it as a casualty, hand waved as it ran out of gas or it's going for rearming or whatever, and you just lose it. Now they can leave the table and return, and that is a welcome change for folks who've spent a lot of time and money on those models.
Indeed. So, of course, today we are recording this on the Tuesday after the announcement. So there was also the big Q&A that they held based on a lot of the Twitter questions that went in. So got some more information there. They didn't talk a whole lot about polished rules in that one.
One thing they did clarify on that, though, is that some of the language they're just cleaning up to make it a little bit easier to understand. But they are adding more examples, right? Because that was something that they found was kind of lacking in 8th edition, was not enough examples to help people fully understand the rules. And they did concede that's going to make the core rules slightly longer than the handful of pages it was before, but I think that's a welcome change for that.
The other thing that I was really excited to hear them talk about today was that they were adding a rules appendix to the back of the core book to kind of answer what they described as those edge cases that you don't see in 95% of your games. I know when 8th edition came out, there were a lot of questions about how different rules interacted, and they needed clarity, and we didn't get that for a few weeks after the edition launched. So I'm excited to see that they're trying to head that off at the pass and really just add that appendix to say, you know what, we get that there's kind of a weird interaction here. It's not worth putting it in the core rules because it's going to make them too wordy, but here's your answer. Just check it out if it comes up.
I think that's a great idea. And while I do think that 8th edition was one of the best editions of the game to date, it does kind of speak to the unnecessary complexity of the rules. When I have a flow chart at the store that walks people through the attack resolution thing, like post-it note by post-it note, so that people can clearly see like where do grot shields trigger, or where do savior protocols trigger, or what's the difference between a lowercase w wound and a capital W wound. So I think that is a good thing. If their goal is to keep the game crunchy and balanced, but also that kind of streamlined that they were looking for when they switched from 7th to 8th. Clearing up those rules is really important.
Yeah, agreed.
Pistols also come to mind as a thing that requires a lot of education.
Yeah. There's a lot of things in the core 8th edition rules that that seem simple enough when you read them, but then if you actually read them for how they are supposed to work, it winds up being something different. So I think just cleaning up and making it clearer what the intention is, as opposed to especially for returning players, letting people rely on how stuff worked before and kind of coloring their view based on that. I think that's going to be really helpful, and examples are probably the best way to do that.
I agree. And I'm hoping, I wish I had a quote to use as an example right now, but there's a handful of rules in the 8th edition rulebook where like relevant rules information is split between paragraphs. Where it'll say like, here is 60% of the rule, and then it'll talk about something else, and then it'll give you the other 40% of the rule in the next paragraph. And I think that kind of stuff also contributed to some of the confusion, because people would it kind of encourage cherry picking of the rules, because you remember a certain quote, you flip to it, you point to that paragraph, and then you tell your friend, hi, I won the argument, and they might have actually been right because you didn't read the paragraph before it.
Right.
So hopefully that will help.
Yeah, agreed. But I will just be happy to see more polish and see kind of an updated and clarified set of rules. I think there are probably a few things that they can clean up just to make it a little clearer and maybe make the interactions less confusing, especially for new players.
Yeah. And I love that 9th edition is really kind of 8th revised, because it sticks to that living document promise that they made at the beginning of 8th edition, instead of just wiping the slate clean again. Right. But speaking of big changes to the core way that certain gameplay functions, Crusade might actually put narrative play kind of on the map for some people. A lot of folks, at least in my experience running a hobby shop and also like organizing events and stuff, there's almost always somebody calling for an escalation league or a some type of slow grow organized play thing, or folks want to run through like a series of narrative missions in the shop, and having a actual system for that in the rules kind of makes that whole section, the whole narrative gameplay type, attractive to folks who might normally think of matched play as the only way of playing 40K. Because now there's going to be a comprehensive system for how to start with a small force, upgrade your leader. What if he's mortally injured? They were talking about like rules for a mortally injured character getting interred in a dreadnought.
Yeah, I thought that was really cool.
I think that kind of stuff is great. The other thing that I hope, I really, really hope that they curate this through the codexes or the codices instead of like just the core rulebook and then White Dwarf articles. I would love to see when they do a 9th edition Space Marine Codex, there is like a 2 or 3 page spread on Crusade rules for the Space Marine Codex, and so on.
I think you're actually going to see even more than that. They've talked a couple times about how, especially in the Q&A today, that Crusade isn't really going to come into its own until the codexes start coming out. And then that's where a lot of the content is going to be found for each individual army and the Crusade rules. So I'm looking forward to that. I also really like that that the way Crusade is formatted, at least from what we've been told, it is supposed to be set up so if you have a friend that wants to play a match play game and they're bringing their competitive Eldar Flyers list, and you want to bring your Crusade army of Iron Warriors, you can bring your Crusade army of Iron Warriors, and you can still have that game count towards your Crusade, benefits and your Crusade changes and all that. And it's still a playable game. It's not just you have to play Crusade against Crusade, and it can only be narrative, and there's no way to interact with any other style of game. So if your play group is small in particular, and you've got a couple guys that are really into match play and playing competitive games, and then you've got that one person that really likes the narrative style, they don't necessarily have to exclude each other when it comes to those. Mm-hmm. So I'm looking forward to that.
I'm really glad they wrote it for narrative play instead of for match play.
Agreed.
That was, having run a handful of kill team leagues, one of the kind of trickiest things is balancing as characters get more powerful, mm-hmm. like making sure that the players are spending the points on them and that kind of stuff. Making sure that the lists stay fair in that way, and having it in narrative play strips away a lot of the potential confusion about, well, how many points does his special Thunderhammer cost? Well, it doesn't cost anything because it's gear. You just pay for the guy.
Right.
So that, I think that was a good idea on their part.
Yeah. I think this is one of those systems that it's really tough to speculate on because it could be mm-hmm. a lot of things. But I think really what it boils down to is that they're adding more reasons to play narrative play other than just, you can play cool missions that are not one-sided. Like it gives you mm-hmm. kind of a campaign feel to it, which looking back through many years of wargaming history, from Games Workshop and from other companies, campaigns tend to be a really popular format as mm-hmm. long as you can get people interested. And so I think a hook like this will really kind of get people into it. So
yeah, I agree. And I'm hoping that it is as thorough and complete as they are kind of pitching that it mm-hmm. will be. Mm-hmm. I know in the past they've, for like stores and stuff, they've sold like an organized play pack, and you buy it, and really what you're buying is just the swag and the prizes. Yeah. And then there's like a 1-sheet PDF of like, you could do this, or you could just have them play a ladder campaign. Right. And you're like, thanks guys. So
super helpful.
So seeing something where it's actually a relatively official kind of complete system, I'm super excited about that.
Yeah, agreed. So the next big change on their list, command points. I think we can both agree, and I think a lot of people will agree as well, that the command point system is great in theory and doesn't quite do what it was intended to do in practice. If anything, it just encourages soupy armies and minimum squads of troops, so you can farm command points. And I think Games Workshop has made it pretty clear, even through 8th edition, that that's not necessarily how they intend the command points and the game in general to be played, or how the detachment system was really intended to be used. Mm-hmm. And so I'm looking forward to kind of seeing what they do in terms of matching it to game size and making it so it's more of a currency that everybody starts on an even playing field with, and then spends down to use tactically rather than accumulating to then use during the game.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that description of it. Something that has always troubled me. I love stratagems. I love command points. I love the idea of a finite resource that you have to manage during the game. And the fact that stratagems are kind of like tactical spells, so to speak. Mm-hmm. I really love that about the game, but I hated the tying them to the detachments that you use, because having having like tactical flexibility and having extra resources to cover your army's gaps should be something that costs a general. You know, it shouldn't reward a general because he ordered extra tanks.
Right.
That's kind of not how resources work. So I really like the idea of them switching to it. It also, you know, being a player who owns, you know, Adeptus Sororitas and Astra Militarum Catechins and also Adeptus Custodes, and Imperial Knights, actually. I've got a handful of knights that I sometimes will bring in. You just can't see the balance between 650 points gets me a guard brigade, 650 points gets me a Custodes battalion of 11 dudes on foot with spears.
Right.
And so, you know, I think I was talking to you about this a couple days ago, ran the math on it. And in a 2,000 point army, you can get 39 command points with a guard army.
Yep.
And 18 command points with a Custodes army. Both of them are making really cheap selections and not buying any upgrades, but that 39 command point guard army has 180 infantry and like 9 vehicles and 27 mortar teams. And whereas the Custodes army is 33 guys, again, with spears. And I'm just really happy to see this change. I think this is going to be huge for the game. I also, it's unclear whether or not more than one detachment is going to have any kind of cost associated with it, but I really like the idea that they're talking about making bringing forces from multiple codices cost almost like you're buying extra relics. They haven't officially named anything, but they've kind of hinted at, like, you got to pay a command point to get access to a different book.
They mentioned it a little bit in the Q&A today. And I'm pretty sure that was one of the things that they said, you know, if you want to bring another codex, it's going to cost you a command point.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good idea.
I agree.
I'm extremely happy about that.
Yeah. The other thing I thought was pretty cool to see was they're kind of changing how you spend command points in some ways. So one of the big ones being that you can spend command points to put things in strategic reserve.
I also hope, and I'm hoping against hope here, that these changes allow them to eliminate tactical reserves. I am hoping that what they do is something along the lines of your free teleporting in matched play is on turn 2 or 3, but you can pay to teleport on turn 1. Or maybe even say, if you only teleport into your deployment zone, you can arrive on turn 1. That way, if you get out deployed because you lost the attacker defender role, then you could be like, you know what? I'm just going to bring my Terminators down on the end of my first movement phase in my deployment zone. Just some type of way to allow more tactical flexibility. Even if that were to cost, I'd be okay with it. But I would just like to see, I think, and maybe this is a little bit of my narrative side showing, but I would like to see, you know, your ability to maybe not null deploy, but go back to being able to deploy very little and then kind of characterfully have like a whole unit of Harlequin or a whole army of Harlequins like walk out of the webway on turn 1. Or, you know, just because that has like a lot of the feel of some of the factions of 40K. And I do think tactical reserves are balanced, and I think it was good that in match play they stopped like alpha strike, deep striking. I'm 100% behind that. But if we're gonna go into a world where we're shaking things up, I would like to see some kind of way that even if it costs you command points, you could bring in Terminators on turn 1 or something.
I like the idea of, if you're going to say deep strike or teleport in or whatever the mechanic happens to be on turn 1, that it has to be in your deployment zone or maybe even on your half of the board. I think not being able to just deep strike turn 1, 9 inches away from enemies and charge away was an important thing.
I will agree with that. I'm not looking to crash into the enemy on turn 1 or anything. But
there's plenty of ways to do that already. So
yeah, I just having played a handful of like the smaller elite armies now, and granted, some of this is going to be addressed just simply by kind of what I alluded to earlier of them adding strategic reserves back to the game allows you to protect some units without being forced to pay the premium of buying somebody who can teleport.
Right.
It allows you to protect some of your cheaper units or some of your maybe less specialized troops. And I would just like to see when somebody plays a smaller, more elite army, if you do choose to put 1 or 2 units in deep strike, to be able to tactically react to the game in a way where you don't feel like you're getting shot off the table because, a third of your points cannot show up for another battle round.
Yeah.
I don't want it to be free, and I don't want to break, I don't want to have somebody figure out a way to have Khorne Berserkers all deep strike 9 inches away on turn 1, not looking for that or anything. Even if it was just something like, you had to stay 18 inches away on turn 1 or something, just something.
Yeah.
It would be nice to have a reaction to it. And I think that would be best done with a stratagem, like charge command points for it. If you have a unit in tactical reserves, you can spend 2 command points or something to grab them on turn 1 instead of waiting. I think that would be neat. But anyway.
Yeah. So kind of moving on from there, one of the next points that they make in their 9 great things about 9th edition is kind of a big one, and that's tanks in combat.
Yes.
And it's something that seems like a pretty good size change, but I think in practice is actually going to kind of radically change the way a lot of armies play and the way a lot of units are used.
I agree. I don't think people fully appreciate the footprint that's going to leave in the game.
Yeah. And I mean, if it were just tanks, it'd be okay. Yeah, that is a big change. But the fact that in their Q&A, they also say pretty much what tanks get, monsters get. Not to use too fine of a pun, but that's a game changer. I mean, that is a massive system change. And
it really
even
is.
if the core rules aren't, going to take up that much more space, what we've basically seen with this and with some of the other stuff that they've announced is the addition of at least a few universal special rules back into the game system. Monster and tank aren't necessarily just a keyword anymore. They actually mean something, and they have an interaction with the rules. Likewise, flyers and blast, which we'll touch on in a few minutes here. Same kind of system there. But I think the big thing with tanks is we can both agree vehicles have a lot of pressure put on them to pull their weight in any game, just because they tend to be more of a point sink, and they tend to be less points efficient than a lot of infantry units in most codexes.
Agreed.
So I'm kind of hoping that this will free up the design team. This will free up list building. This will free up just your general army setup to kind of utilize more vehicle heavy armies without feeling like that you've got the rock, and if you run into someone's paper, then you might as well just not play the game.
Agreed. And I know in previous episodes we've actually discussed like firing arcs and things like that. We recently just had a conversation before all this about what we thought it would take to make make tanks great again, and we were just kind of spitballing ideas like increasing their saves or introducing firing arcs and facings back into the game, and I think a lot of people felt like the change from armor and hull points to having a standard stat line really made vehicles more vulnerable, and they didn't really get a lot for that change. And I personally love that the vehicles are running on the same operating system as other units are, but there are unintended consequences, like shadow swords being able to fire their whole fixed mounted weapons behind them, or kind of the weirdness of a tank that has historically been more heavily armored in the front and lightly armored in the rear, now just being kind of the same stats no matter where you come from. There were tons of unintended consequences in addition to the threat that vehicles faced from just small arms fire, because you can bury them in dice now where you couldn't before. And so I'm really hoping that this is something that can add back to their value. That this, to me, almost feels like the thing they should have added when they changed the vehicle stat line in the first place. And then we might see more tanks that are not repulsor executioners in the game. The other thing that I am personally a little curious about is I can't, and maybe you heard something that I didn't, I'm not sure they've been really clear on whether or not the tanks can fire into their own close combat, or they can just fire as if they're not in close combat.
They have not been clear on that as far as I'm aware.
Okay. That's what, because it just, in one thing they said that they can fire while in close combat, and then in another thing they just kind of descriptively explained, if you get tied up, you can just blast those guys off your tank and keep rolling.
Right.
And so I was like, oh, okay, now which is it? Is it that tanks basically function like pistols if they're locked in combat, or is it that they're all like Bane blades that just don't care whether you lock them in combat or not?
That would be my guess.
I'm hoping that's what it is.
Yeah, that's my guess. Because otherwise you still run into the same issue of, great, I've got my Lehman Russ that is swarmed by Tyranid Rippers, and I really would like to shoot its battle cannon at that Carnifex, but I guess I'll shoot it at the Ripper swarm.
Yes, I'll shoot it at the ground right in front of me.
Right. So I'm hoping that that's how they do that.
Yep.
I think. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're fine.
Kind of along those lines too. They mentioned today that there's gonna be some changes to Overwatch. Didn't really expand on what that was going to look like, but it seemed like, if anything, it might wind up being a little less deadly, was the impression I got. And
so
more importantly,
I'm hoping so.
Yeah. And more importantly, apparently it's going to be made harder to fall back. So
yes,
I think this change to tanks and monsters being able to shoot while still engaged in close combat, I think that dovetails nicely with it being harder to fall back, because realistically, there's not really a good reason for 2 grots to make it so if I roll backwards with my Lehman Russ, I can't shoot with it. But it's also not that difficult for them to keep up with it. So, not having as easy a time falling back, but tanks being able to shoot, because realistically they don't care about the couple of guys that are standing around the sides. They can just they can keep trying to run them over in combat, but shoot other stuff when they're not. I mean, I think that all works really nicely, and I think we're going to see that really makes vehicles and non-close combat monsters just overall more prevalent in the game and worth their points. Tyranids really took a hit when their artillery critters were functionally useless.
I'm excited about that. As a talking about the fallback thing, they did allude in the Q&A to it being potentially stratagem based, where you can like spend command points to either prevent people from falling back or like make them make a test,
right?
To do so, because they vaguely hinted at using command points to do that. And I'm hoping what that means is the game will have more universal stratagems than like 3 or 4. I'm hoping there'll be like a 1 or 2 page, everybody can do these things.
Right. And I think the ability to influence your opponent falling back and either prevent or at least make them kind of not be sure that they can fall back. I think that's a really powerful and interesting ability. I mean, you see a lot of Drukhari lists when they bring small units of witches. Their primary purpose is 4 witches and then 1 with a shardnet and impaler, and they're just there to make it tough for stuff to fall back. So you can charge into whatever, even a tank. That's a great example of why tanks should be able to just shoot in combat. My 5 witches shouldn't be able to charge into your Land Raider Redeemer and just go, you're not going anywhere, so don't bother using those flamestorm cannons.
Yeah, and I also think that, you know, some armies are much better at like tri-pointing and locking in a unit than other armies are. And if they have the ability to move those type of things into stratagems or into command point expenditure, it kind of levels the playing field for armies that maybe only have Custodes again, for instance. Like, you know, many of your Custodes units are only like 3 models.
Exactly.
And so the ability to keep people in combat without having to bring 90 Gretchen to circle the unit, or, you know, 10 Kroot to circle something.
Right.
I also, and this is a little bit of wish listing, but when it comes to tanks, you know, we've heard a lot of people talking at the shop, like on our Facebook page and stuff, or messaging us talking about, you know, when are we going to reopen for games and that kind of stuff. And as soon as ninth edition got announced, that conversation switched to, you know, what rules are we going to get, you know, and what do you think it's going to be? And like half of the people bring up tank shock. Like it's just like half of every thread changes to tank shock at some point. And what I am hoping, and this is entirely wish listing and speculation, I am hoping that instead of returning a tank shock that is like almost like a charge attack, I hope that tanks or vehicles in general get a alternative to falling back that's called something like rolling forward, where they can just drive forward through a unit that tar pits them, and then maybe have like on a 6+ they do D3 mortal wounds or something. Like something where it's like, you know what, if you want to tie up my tank, you go ahead and try, but it's a Lehman Russ and it's just going to roll forward and it doesn't care. I would love to see something like that as to kind of a nod to the old tank shock rules, you know, the whole death or glory, that all that whole system before that, where you know, you tie up or the tank would charge into a unit and somebody could stand their ground and get a free shot in on the tank. And if it was something where the tank could actually aggressively leave combat, I think that would be flavorful, and also something that vehicles could use to get on the map again. But that I want to preface that is not based on any rumors, that is not based on any leaks, that is entirely me just hoping that they do that.
And I would agree with that. I think it just adds a nice narrative element to it. And it makes tanks feel, for lack of a better term, tankier. You know, they're not just boxes with guns. They're actually, you know, giant chunks of metal or plasteel or wraithbone or whatever you want to call it. And using that weight is enough to cause some damage.
And you see bespoke rules like Steel Behemoth, and you read it and you're like, oh, it moves and doesn't get a -1 to shoot. Or, you know, Grinding Advance, like, oh, this gun shoots twice. Like, you know, where is this is a giant adamantine brick and it's rolling down a hill. You know, like, where's that rule?
It's so like Bane Blades, I think, represent that really well with their adamantine Trex melee weapon. But other tanks are still pretty big. They should be able to do some damage, not just on a 6+ to hit.
You know, and you get like the Sisters Forge World Repressor that hits on a 5 because it's meant to, like, you know, it's got that dozer blade that's meant to be like a riot control device or whatever, and it's strength 6 AP -1 damage, but it multiplies attacks like the Stompy Feet on a knight. Like, why does a Rhino chassis have a snowplow that does that, whereas like a Lehman Russ can't just drive over people? You know, like, it doesn't.
Put a dozer blade on a Chimera or a Lehman Russ and be able to do stuff like that. You know, it's that rule could have been, you know, when they eliminated things like immobilization tests and dangerous terrain and that kind of stuff, they could have made dozer blades do exactly that. It's an attack ×3 AP -1, weapon skill +1 upgrade. And you just put it on any vehicle, you know, or something. Or you know, when this vehicle charges, when you finish the charge roll die for each model within an inch of it on a 5+, that model or that model's unit takes a mortal wound or whatever. You know, whatever it winds up being. So, but
something. they dropped the ball on that. So I'm really happy to see that they're adjusting tanks. I'm happy that they're adjusting monsters. I'm not happy that that includes the Riptide, but that's just me.
Points rebalancing anyway.
Yeah, that's true.
But hey, you mentioned dangerous terrain, and our next point to talk about is terrain. So I think that's a good segue.
I thought we'd never get here.
We're here.
Oh, this is my favorite place.
Yeah, go for it.
Can we stay here
for a little while?
Terrain. Terrain. So in their attempt to streamline 8th edition and make everything easy, a ball that they admitted themselves that they dropped at the Saturday reveal was they made terrain way too simple
and boring.
Yes, and so not only was it frustratingly plain, but also there's like 15 or 12 or something different official terrain kits that all have their own names and keywords, and when you look up their rules, it basically says it's a ruin but this, or treat this exactly like a ruin and this, or or there's completely nonsensical things like the sealed frontierist building, which is the out of one of the kill zones for kill team, has on the roof a barricade. And then the data sheet has a rule that says if you are on the roof of this building, you cannot receive the benefit of cover. But the model has at the front of the building a barricade.
Makes a lot of sense. This checks out.
Yeah. So that just I could rant for hours about how the terrible terrain rules of 8th edition have affected so many games. Early on in the edition, trading shots between a big mech with shock attack gun and a Triarch Stalker or a Doomsday Arc or something that were on opposite sides of the table, shooting at each other through like a single window on a ruin right in the middle of the table, and neither of them were getting any kind of negative to hit or plus to their save, even though they could see like a centimeter of each other. It's just, I get simplicity, seems faster, but it doesn't help if it doesn't feel good. And the terrain rules for 8th edition did not feel good. And what they talked about on the initial launch in the Q&A was just much more clearly defined, interesting, like redone from the ground up terrain rules. They talked about pieces of terrain that will obscure line of sight completely, taking kind of a nod from some of the competitive formats out there where there's like a keyword or like an ability tag that terrain pieces will have called, I think it's obscuring or obscured or something like that.
I think they called it obscuring, but
yeah. And so that entire terrain piece blocks line of sight. It doesn't matter if it's got windows. It doesn't matter if it's got holes in the wall. The terrain piece blocks line of sight because maybe there's smoke coming out of it, or maybe it's, the whole thing is falling apart. Just that's the type of simplicity that would have been better for the game. Like, make the terrain interesting and cool, but just make it a very simple, like, it does this, instead of if you're in cover, you get cover, and also not, which is pretty much how complicated 8th terrain rules were.
Right. Yeah, the one thing that I found kind of interesting, and I'm hoping that this was stated this way intentionally as opposed to just being kind of an off the cuff remark, but they mentioned in the Q&A today that there will be different kinds of cover. So I'm wondering if we're going to go back to seeing if you're in X, Y, or Z kind of cover, then you get +1. If you're in, A, B, or C, it's +2 to your save. I think stuff like that, it relies on people defining things before the game. But I would argue that it's good practice to just agree on that stuff with your opponent before the game anyway. So that way there's no hard feelings.
Well, and that's something that, at least in our local meta, that we've always done is, the game starts, you just go, okay, forest, ruin, hill, barricade. It takes like 15 seconds and you just point everything out on the table. Everybody agrees on it. And then, going forward what it is. And I think nothing about that requires that the terrain rules be remedial.
No,
as long as everything is clearly defined. And I think that's, I'm really, really excited about this. Like, I cannot speak to how that is the thing I'm looking forward to most in ninth edition, honestly, is just to see what they do with terrain. I'm also really curious if they're going to do something that I've been wanting all of 8th edition, which is the separation of cover and concealment. So instead of just obscuring where it blocks line of sight, I'm wondering if certain terrain pieces might give minuses to hit.
That'd be interesting. It'll be very interesting with the revelation today that they're going to be capping modifiers to +1 or -1. But it'll be interesting to see how that plays out with things. Certainly will change the face of, a lot of lists, especially ones reliant on flyers.
Yeah, and along those lines, and this is slightly tangential, but they capped the modifiers that you can get to +1 or -1 net modifier, and they also introduced the kind of city fight style lucky 6s, where just like 1s always fail, now 6s are always going to succeed, at least within whatever rules mechanic that applies to. Like it might just be attack rolls and wound rolls, or it might be all die rolls. They weren't clear, but that 6s will always succeed. And so I am really intrigued by capping modifiers at 1 and also making 6s always succeed. I wonder if 6s were always going to succeed, if they could have capped it at 2, just so that armies could still have that kind of characterful ability, because of the fact that everybody is always going to hit on a 6 regardless.
Right.
Maybe that's just me. I have off and on for years wondered why many editions ago they didn't switch the system to a D10 based system instead of a D6 based system, because there's only so much you can do with a 6-sided die.
Right.
And I get that feeling a little bit about capping the modifiers at 1, is if the modifiers are capped at 1, you're taking away another thing you can do that differentiates things when you only have a random number generator of 1 to 6. But I think capping is awesome. I think it's necessary. I think that armies were they were able to just abuse that. Insanely. So I don't know. Like I'm not saying I think capping it at 1 is a bad thing. I wonder if capping it at 2 would have been okay if 6s are always hitting.
I'm curious to see how it plays out in practice. I agree. That's for sure. I think that's going to be a tough one to. That's going to be a tough one to do anything more than speculate wildly on without seeing what the rule actually looks like.
But once they do 9th edition codexes too, modifiers, if they're capped at 1, modifiers might get a lot more rare anyway.
Right. And so, I know over the course of the past probably year and a half of 8th edition, there's been kind of a shift more towards making that stacking penalties to hit in particular a little tougher to do. And I think that a lot of that came from, early on seeing the absolute dominance of LATOC flyers and that kind of list, where it doesn't feel good to play against, because
that's true.
Your opponent doesn't have to do anything other than pick the right units and pick the right craft world, chapter tactic, whatever, and all of a sudden their army becomes 33% more difficult to hit.
Well, I still remember the sting of figuring out. One time I was playing orcs before the codex, so Daka wasn't a thing yet, and I was at the shop, and somebody came in and set down a Eldar, a LATOC, and Corsairs list with the Forge World Corsairs, and everything, all the Hornets and all the fire prisms and basically everything they had, their Wraith fighters and everything had the upgrade, the Beckert engines, or no, the one that gives them -1 to be hit if they advance.
Yep.
And then they ran all of those vehicles in Craft World of LATOC, and then just took the -1 to hit with all of the assault weapons that were mounted on all the vehicles, and they just advanced every turn. And I'm sitting there with an orc speed freak army going, awesome, your army is untargetable, because I need every unit in my army but the grot this grot right here,
Yep.
or whatever. Like it wasn't a grot. It was like a big mech with a git finder or something. There's like one model in my army that could hit things on a 6, and everybody else needed a 7+. So I was like, this feels awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. As an Eldar player, I can say before the Codex came out, when some of the rules in the edition or in the index even were not necessarily as clear or as restrictive, there were a couple times, especially with Rangers, where I could just see an opponent being like, wow, this is dumb. This isn't even fun anymore. My dudes, because of penalties and everything, literally cannot hit any of your troops. And when the Alatok Craft World benefit dropped in the Codex, it was one of those things where it just got worse. So I'm glad to see them doing that capping. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But kind of back on the terrain side of things, there was one thing they mentioned in the Q&A today that I think I know I was very happy about, and I'm pretty sure you will be too, because we've complained about this to each other in games many times, and that's levels of things like ruins and other terrain are going to be a lot less impactful on what can fight and what can't. So no more my scout is on level 2 of the ruin and your Imperial Knight that towers over even the top floor can't hit him because terrain.
Yeah. Like literally my weapons are like at the level of your guy, but I can't charge you in close combat. And they tried to fix that with the Knight stratagem that allows you to, spend command points to attack a building basically, but it was cost prohibitively expensive, right? And silly. I would have much rather seen a stratagem that allowed a Knight to remove a terrain feature from the table than the stratagem that they had.
Yeah, and like they said in the Q&A today, you have things like Hive Tyrants or flying Hive Tyrants. Like what are you gonna? It can't fight it because it can't fit on that level of the ruin, even though it's literally eye level with the guardsmen that are in there. Like it leads to a lot of feels bad moments. And it seems like they're really trying to minimize those with some of these changes. So I'm looking forward to that.
I'm really curious how they're going to do it. Do you have a guess? I have a guess.
I mean, I would guess that things with the Titanic or monster keyword either will ignore levels of ruins or will be able to, be able to fight against a certain number of levels, or they might add back in vertical fighting. I would guess one of those would be the main thing, but what do you think?
I'm thinking it's going to be a vertical coherency thing.
Yeah.
It'll be like barricades where, barricades make the 1-inch bubble into a 2-inch bubble. I think it's going to be something like if you can get one level away, then the bubble becomes like 5 inches or something. Like it'll be something where the Hive Tyrant is actually like out in front of the building on the ground, like ripping load-bearing members out of the building so that people are falling. And, I'm thinking it's going to be something like that. I don't think it's going to be treat everything in the building as if it's on the ground level. I don't think it'll be like that.
Yeah, I don't
they'll still have some benefit for climbing up into the 3rd floor of a building, or something like that.
Yeah. Well, and that's how it was. What was that, 5th edition? I don't remember if it was the same in 6th or 7th, but I'm pretty sure in 5th it was you had you fought within an inch horizontally and up to 6 inches vertically.
That sounds familiar. Level. Yeah, and with their official kits, that basically meant you could fight 1 floor away.
Right. Yep.
So I'm super excited about that.
Yeah.
Because that was one of the most frustrating parts of terrain.
Yeah, just when you saw things like with Triptide, where great, I'm up against Imperial Knights. Cool. I'm just going to jump him up into the top floor of this ruin because it has fly, and now your knight can't touch me. It doesn't feel good. It makes fly even more powerful. I'm glad to see it change.
Yeah, no, I agree. We had there was this maybe a year ago, we had somebody come in and want to do a bunch of practice for an ITC event. And so we had a bunch of our more competitive players kind of line up and just run this dude through a gauntlet. And there were some really frustrating interactions where, because he was doing like a Loyal 32 and Imperial Knights kind of, the standard of the time.
Yep.
And two of our competitive players that were just couldn't, weren't tuned for that kind of list, started using terrain shenanigans to just shut him down.
Yeah.
There were two buildings on the table that functionally had no line of sight into them. So they just moved their infantry into them and stayed more than an inch away from the walls. And then the knights, all that he could shoot at them were his mortar teams. And it just, the game shut completely down to mortars, your turn, mortars, your turn.
Yep. It's not fun.
Yeah. It just is not, that's not a great experience for anybody.
Yep. No. So, I think there's a lot of things we could talk about with terrain, but we'll have to kind of curtail this discussion. I'm looking forward to seeing more about it, though. That's for sure.
Me too. Me too.
Kind of moving on to our next point, though, game size. I know this is a big one for me, because a lot of times I don't have 3 or 4 hours to put in for a game. And as much as I would love to, it's just the way it is a lot of times. So to be able to have a balanced feeling game at 1,000 points or 1,200 points or whatever might be the case, as opposed to feeling like if I'm playing less than 1,750, it's not really a game of 40K. I think that's a big deal. And I'm really hoping that as optimistic as they are about this being a change and being a successful one, I hope that pans out.
I agree.
The thing that I found really interesting about it was that game size will affect command points, which I think makes sense with the way they're doing this. But that's nice to see, because that means they thought about, okay, how are resources going to be used in these, and what does having too many resources do to unbalance the size? But the other thing being that individual missions are suggested for certain game sizes. So the read I got on this was basically, if you're playing 500 points, you should use these missions. If you're playing 1,000 points, you should use these missions. If you're 1,500 or more, these missions are going to be the ones you want to use. And I think that's a great idea, because we've probably all had the experience of, I want to get a quick game in. Here's 1,000 points. We'll roll a random mission. Oh, the way this one is set up, it only works if I have at least 40 models on the table. Well, I'm playing Custodes in 1,000 points, so I have 7.
Yeah, or you're playing say you're running a Astra Militarum army, and you're playing a 750 or 1,000 point game, and then the mission that you roll up is Big Guns Never Tire, and you're the only player that brought 5 heavy support choices.
Right.
Because you're the only player who can afford 5 heavy support choices in 750. So I absolutely agree. One of my favorite ways to play, don't get me wrong, I enjoy the 1850, 1750, 2000. I enjoy those. That's probably the sweet spot for like a competitive game, is the near 2,000 point mark. But I do occasionally enjoy the 2,500, 3,000 point games.
Sure.
But what I really, really like are 750 and 1,000. Because a 750 or 1,000 point game, you can get 2 games in the time that you could get 1 game in of 2,000. And I think that anytime you can play a game to its end, and you can get more games in your time, switch up opponents, do things, I think that's good. And I think that balancing the game for that is going to be so much nicer, because I can't tell you how many times I've sat down to play a 750 game, and like you said earlier, based on the mission that gets rolled up, you're like, cool, I have to play to kill, which is one of the, depending on your opponent and whether or not there's drinking involved, playing to kill playing to kill tends to be, in my opinion, one of the less interesting ways to play. I don't
absolutely.
I don't want to just deploy and then try to shoot each other off the table.
Yep. It's great for teaching people how to play the game, so they get the core mechanics. But
absolutely. No Mercy is like my favorite training mission. Because it's just, because you can just like, let's learn the rules. Your objective is kill.
Yep.
But That's not my favorite way to play.
Right.
And when you play a small game and you roll not like one of two missions, you end up basically going, well, because I chose to play my Space Marines today, or because I chose to bring Custodes instead of Dark Eldar, I pretty much have to just try to kill the other guy because
Right.
I can't hold the objectives, or I can't achieve this goal. And that doesn't feel great.
No, not at all. Yeah, it's something that I'm very hopeful about. I hope it really kind of pans out and winds up being as good as it sounds. So
yeah,
I guess we'll have to see on that. But kind of along the lines of those missions too, I thought it was really interesting to note that that they specifically designed the new missions and consulted tournament organizers on the new missions to make sure that they are better suited for competitive play.
Yes, I saw that as well. In the Saturday initial announcement, one of the guest speakers, or I guess not even a guest speaker anymore, one of the speakers was the gentleman who kind of heads up the Nova tournament.
Yeah.
And he has been brought on as the Warhammer community team's, like, I don't recall his exact job title, but it's functionally like head of organized play.
Yeah.
And he has been one of, like, involved in playtesting since before 8th edition. And he's, written tons of tournament packets for the Nova Open. And in that interview, it was danced around, but basically implied that not only was he brought on to help, kind of help Games Workshop maybe go to war with some of the existing competitive formats that are out there, but also that he had a hand in the finalizing of the missions that are in the core game. It was talked about in that interview that he helped, and that was very heartening for me, just because one of the things, and this is me as a tournament organizer and a store owner, it is always frustrating when you say, I want to run an event, and half of your player base says ITC isn't real 40K, and the other half of your player base says might not be real 40K, but it's the standard. So
right.
And then you don't know which one to do. And I really feel like a lot of those formats came to be because Games Workshop years ago backed away from holding their Rogue Traders and backed away from holding their grand tournaments. And so somebody had to step in and fill that void, and they did. I would really like to see it go back to a standard. So that it just be like, we're running a 40K tournament. Well, what kind of tournament? A 40K tournament. And so I'm really excited for that aspect of it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I miss Rogue Trader tournaments. I thought it was
agreed.
That was really my first exposure to tournament play, and I really enjoyed it. So I'm hoping we see kind of a more standardized. This is what the official competitive 40K looks like.
Yes, I would love that.
I can't say nothing against the ITC format, because I do have some gripes with it. I see the need for it. I see why they did a lot of what they did. I don't begrudge anybody who enjoys playing it, but it's I will freely admit I'm one of those people that says, like, it can be fun and everything, but the way it interacts with the game changes how things are balanced a little bit too much for my tastes.
Yeah. And one of the things that I struggled with was, Games Workshop has been trying harder throughout 8th edition to, like, pay attention to the competitive scene for the curation of point values and things. And when the majority of the competitive events globally are using these alternate formats that, secondary objectives and things like that change what units are good, with Games Workshop listening to the competitive community, that means the points are being curated for a format that's not even the main game. And so you have units becoming more expensive because they're good in the ITC, and then they become unplayable in regular casual 40K because they cost 15 points too much, and so I just, that's something I would like to see. And I'm with you in the respect of, I've tried a lot of, let me really chew on the ITC format. Let me really do this. And and I'm intrigued by maybe traveling, going to some tournaments and playing ITC. And I think there's a lot of great ideas. I like that the secondaries add like a meta level of tactical, planning. But overall, for the health of the game, I don't know that I can get behind a format where, I mean, the missions are where a good chunk of 40K the game lives.
Right.
Because even though the core rules run the math, the missions are what the game is. And if the missions are these different things with a different way of earning your victory points and all these secondary objectives, it changes what's useful. It changes how units interact with each other, what's beneficial. And I don't know that it's healthy for the game overall.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think in the Q&A today, they made a really interesting point, and I hadn't, it made sense once they said it. I hadn't really thought about it enough to look at the game this way, but the rules writers today talked about how every standard game of 40K really has 4 players. You've got the 2 people who are actually playing the game, you have the terrain, and you have the mission. And those, you can't control 3 and 4. You have to adapt to 3 and 4. And so the idea that, to kind of continue the analogy there, if you're playing ITC, your 4th player has a different version of the rule book.
Yeah.
And so it just kind of, a lot of times it just affects things more than it should, in my opinion. Well,
I agree. I agree. It also has an unintended impact on like local communities.
Yes.
Because if the majority of the content on the internet to consume is, say, ITC or ETC or WTC, whatever, whichever, pick any random format. If the majority of the YouTube stuff is going to talk about that format, new players are going to watch that. And if they have a competitive drive, or if they kind of lean that way, they're going to start building their army around it. And then if they go to their local stores and their local stores are not running ITC events, there's going to be, bad feels there, because there's going to be like, well, I brought a bunch of mortar teams because of magic boxes, and the store's like, yeah, we don't use that rule.
Right.
And then the person's like, oh, well, crap, I would have brought a Lehman Russ if I knew, and I think that's the one of the unintended consequences is it is like college football versus NFL football for American audiences, where like they're basically the same game, but enough little rules are different that if you only ever watch one and then you watch one game of the other, you get super confused as to how a certain thing happened. And it's the same thing, if you build your game around ITC and then show up to a tournament that's just running Maelstrom missions.
Oh yeah, it
doesn't work.
No, that's a huge difference. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how all that plays out. That's another part. As excited as I am about the terrain changes, I'm probably almost as excited about seeing how the new quote unquote mission pack plays out. So, I'm looking forward to that.
That's definitely something to watch.
Yeah. So it's, in terms of strategy and everything, though, and changes to more of the rules, these last 3 points are all basically changes to how some of the rules works. One of them in terms of strategic reserves being more tactical, the other 2 being more functional. So strategic reserves, we covered it pretty well, I think, earlier. They didn't say a whole lot more. You made an interesting point when we were talking about this earlier today, though, that the way you had interpreted one of their comments was that the later in the game your strategic reserves arrive, the kind of further behind enemy lines they'd be able to deploy. And
it did sound that way. Now it could have just been kind of flowery descriptive text, but it sounded like there is one cost to place a unit in strategic reserves, and then the longer you hold them there, the deeper onto the battlefield they're able to enter. And there had been a rumor running around the internet between Saturday and Tuesday, when the Q&A was, about that it would be like whatever the cost to put something in reserves, what it would play out is if they showed up on turn 1, they walked on your table edge in your deployment zone. And then on turns 2 or 3, they could come in on the side, but not in your enemy's deployment zone. And then if you came in after that, you could do the old-fashioned outflanking where you came in on your enemy's side of the table. And obviously that is, that's rumor mongering and speculation, but that their comment today kind of, I guess, maybe reinforced that, or perhaps I went into it with like a skewed perception because I had heard that rumor.
Sure.
But yeah, it sounded, I think it was Stu that said it. It sounded like he said, you could hold them in reserve, come in on the sides of the table, or if you hold them long enough, you could outflank your enemy. And it was some statement that implied that time mattered.
Right. I have not gotten a chance to go back and watch the video, the recap. I watched it live, but I haven't gotten to see the recap itself. But I want to go check that out because I think that would make for even more tactical depth and really make it more interesting in a lot of ways. I know you and I have talked about this before, that we both think one of the best parts about wargaming in general, and because we play 40K mostly, about 40K is when you're playing, being able to play a game where you're forced to make interesting choices. And I think that really just amplifies that part of the game where you're saying, okay, my opponent held his squad of 10 Death Company in reserve until turn 3. Are they going to, they're not in deep strike, so are they going to come in behind my lines? How do I adapt to that? Is it going to mess up, my castle in the back with all my buffing, or is he coming on the side and he's going to mess up, the spearhead that I've thrust forward? It adds another layer of depth that I think makes the game better in the long run and raises the skill ceiling, if that makes sense.
It does. And there's two things that I think of based on what you just said. And the first one being, I know I tend to lean more in the competitive way, but I do enjoy like the narrative and the cinema and the kind of epicness of the story of what's going on. And there is a degree of drama to, I sent my troops around behind and they're not there yet.
Right.
That, it kind of feels like, you've got your Catachin colonel screaming into his Voxcaster, like, where is my, unit of veterans? And they're like, we're still by the bridge, sir. We're pinned down. It just adds that kind of feeling of they can't sneak up behind you yet because they're not there yet.
Right.
And I think, even though I do tend to lean more on the competitive side, like I still enjoy that. If I wanted to play a purely competitive game, I'd play chess. I still like the immersion, and I think that rules like that, where not only is there that meaningful choice of you have to wait for the best benefit, and then where's the sweet spot between well, I got to go now, even though I'm not going to get what I really wanted.
Right.
Versus waiting and getting what you wanted. But I also think it creates that immersion. It's kind of silly in previous editions when you had units like Kroot Hounds that could outflank, where you would hold them and then in turn 2 they would just walk on your enemy's deployment zone. And this was in previous editions. Like, well, how'd they get all the way over there? They're not teleporters. They don't get dropped out of an airplane.
Right.
So I think there is a degree of kind of cool factor there, and that's the first point. The second point, and this is more of a tactical thing, I am hoping that there is a way for you to bring strategic reserves on in your opponent's backfield, because while it is a good tactic, there is nothing interesting or fun about 400 chaff infantry spaced out by 2 inches apiece covering their entire backfield.
Screening. Yeah.
And so while screening is still going to have a tactical use to deflect deep striking, if you can hold a unit or 2 of close combat guys to come in behind enemy lines, if you have that like widespread screen, you're basically inviting an unfailable charge, because wherever they walk on the table, they've only got to roll a 4 or whatever. Granted, the outflank may have a restriction, like you can't walk on within 9 inches or whatever, but you're you're essentially covering your backfield in stakes on the floor, waiting for the wolves to come along,
right,
you know?
right.
And that I think will perhaps force people to make more meaningful choices, as we said before, about, do I want to cover my entire backfield, or do I really only want to screen what I have to?
Right.
And so because that is something that's just, you know, when you're setting up deployment, I totally get the tactical reason. I totally get why guys do it. But when you're watching somebody just set like guardsman, 2 inches, guardsman, 2 inches, guardsman, 2 inches, you're like, cool, I'm going to go get a sandwich. I'll be back in a little bit.
Yep.
You know, it's just, and it just looks weird on the table too, when you see a unit of like 30 poxwalkers strung across like 15 feet of table, you know. It just looks weird, and it the game slower,
and it leads to kind of some odd ways of playing things, where you're doing stuff like taking cheap characters just because they basically make an 18-inch zone of no deep strike, and rather than using them for their auras and using them for their abilities, they literally just hide behind cover or out of line of sight or whatever to keep things from dropping in too close to your guys in the back. And it just kind of
I've been absolutely guilty of that with my AdMech army, because the secondary HQ choice in pretty much every battalion is a tech priest engine seer.
Yeah.
And in most cases, because I run Mars and I tend to have a backfield castle and a moving castle, but in most games, regardless of who my opponent is, it's tactically valuable to just measure 9 inches diagonal in from each corner of the table and then hide a tech priest behind a piece of terrain. And then I just screen out a 9-inch bubble on both of my flanks. And it was like, oh, there was 60 points. That's cool. They weren't going to fix anything anyway.
Yeah.
Like I have absolutely been guilty of that. And while I'm doing it, I'm like, I wish I didn't have to do this, but I do, because I'm playing in a tournament. Or whatever.
It's a valid tactic. It's one of those things that, in terms of feeling good, it tends to not. Both as the player and as the opponent.
Yep. Oh. I agree. So hopefully strategic reserves will help kind of deal with some of the goofier, interactions.
Yeah.
I mentioned the like 8-foot wall of poxwalkers earlier. If you can get one end of the wall on one objective and the other end of the wall on another objectives, you can just start removing the casualties from the middle, and you're going to hold both objectives all game, because you've got,
they can't move at that point.
Yeah. And so it's just like those kind of silly things might happen less if somebody can charge in from the side of the table.
Right.
So, and then back to the list of changes to the game, blast weapons. That's one of the things that people have complained about the loss of blast templates about, is how people place their units, and how like in previous editions you had to be more careful about where you put your guys. And when the game shifted to just randomly rolling things, the game got faster with the removal of that mini game, and I'm betting across the board arguments have decreased by a measurable percentage.
Sure.
But that's another thing that has to do with like some kind of silly placements for units and stuff are a consequence of that. And also it doesn't feel great when you're looking at like a Lehman Russ battle cannon, or a the Conqueror. No, is it Conqueror? The long-barreled one, the anti-tank one that only shoots once. Vanquisher, thank you. So you've got the Vanquisher cannon that's supposed to be the anti-tank round, and it only shoots once, and it does slightly more damage. And then you have the what used to be the large blast template battle cannon, and you're looking at it stat-wise going, okay, I might as well just shoot the battle cannon at the tank, because I'm going to get a random number of shots because it's supposed to explode big and kill more guys. But really all it does is make it more efficient as a tank hunting weapon than the variant that was supposed to hunt tanks.
Right.
And the only solution to that in the current system would be to make the tank hunting one ridiculously strong. And then you end up with balance issues with, okay, now this gun is too powerful. So that going, if they're not going to put blast templates back in the game, which personally, I'm glad it doesn't seem like they're going to. I like the idea of a new weapon type that lets Tau submunitions and Lehman Russ battle cannons and rapid fire battle cannons on Imperial Knights, that lets those type of weapons really do what they were supposed to do.
Yeah. I agree with that. I liked blast templates a lot, but they definitely slowed down the game. And I think I can't say I miss them in the sense that I think the game would be better with them. They were fun, but they also caused arguments, and they slowed stuff down. The biggest thing being, especially if you were playing a horde army, you know, whether that's Tyranids or Orcs, or in a lot of cases even Guard, you know, you had to be so meticulous about, you know, spacing your guys as maximally as possible without losing coherency, because my opponent's got a flamer template. You know, he's gonna drive up and hit me with that, and if I space them right, I'll take 4 hits. If I space them wrong, I'll take 16. You know, it's just,
Yeah.
I appreciate how much quicker it is, and the fact that a lot of times it just looks cooler to see a blob of, you know, 60 termagants running up the board, as opposed to them being spaced out very carefully in ranks. So that way, you know, it fits better. It makes for a nice look. So I think it's a good change, and I'm glad to see that not only are they coming out with a way to kind of bring back some of the feel of templates and the feel of anti-horde weapons, but also that they're going to be, you know, assigning that rule as necessary from the start, and then as new codexes come out, that they'll be, you know, they'll actually have the weapon type. So that's a welcome change in my book. But one that they haven't talked a whole lot about, which I'm looking forward to seeing more of, kind of along the lines of the last point they make, which is flyers. Basically, all we've heard is they don't die when they go off the board. I'm not sure what that looks like beyond there. You know, is it kind of like it used to be in 6th and 7th edition, where there was sort of a mini game involved? Is it just if they go off the board, they can come in again on your next turn from your deployment zone? Do they have to come in from the board edge? I'm not sure. It's been like a footnote on all the points, and there weren't a lot of questions asked about it today either.
There weren't. I wonder if everybody is assuming that it's just going to go back to they re-enter reserves. If that's the case, what happens if you fly off the table on turn 3 and then it rolls over to turn 4?
Well, so in the current system, that would be fine because it deployed initially, so it can come on in later turns. It's not considered automatically destroyed.
That's true. Unless it's worded as it returns to tactical reserves.
Right. But, and then, then it would be, oh boy, I don't even want to think about that.
Yeah.
But regardless, flyers.
Cleaner, more polished rules.
Yes, exactly. Flyers not, you know, just randomly dying because a millimeter of their base couldn't fit is a welcome change.
Yeah. And I also think that it also removes the need. I don't know what they're going to do rules wise, but it removes the need to be like a stickler about whether or not the wing is hanging off the table.
Right.
If the planes can leave the table again, then we might see it go back to just make sure the base is on the table.
Yeah. Which I think makes sense.
Yeah. Which I think is it's just easier.
Yeah.
Also, it's easier to get to your troops around your flyers in your deployment zone if you can back the flyer up a little bit.
Yep, exactly.
So we'll see. What I'm wondering is it going to be flyer specific, or are other units going to be like, I wonder if other units will gain the ability to like walk off the table and enter some type of reserve, or, you know, just, I wonder if it opens up that precedent for future like special rules, you know, like a slime arbo or orc commandos or something, where, or like in 7th edition there was that piranha formation where if the piranhas if a single piranha survived and it flew off the table on the next turn, the entire formation could return to the table at full strength. And it was one of the 7th edition crazy Kung Fu Hong Kong action theater version of 40K special things.
Yeah.
But just the idea of like, does that open the precedent up for there to be units that can like advance off the table just to get away from the enemy, and then you can redeploy them later in the game somewhere else because they snuck around. Or like, I think the fact that if they give that back to flyers, it just opens up the potential for cool bespoke rules for future units.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting to see too.
Yeah, something like Slime Arbo, where he can, what is it, fade into shadows or whatever his power is. Or that would be an awesome Gene Stealer cult thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Go back into Cult Ambush or something like that.
Yeah. And again, they have not said anything like this, but just if they remove the precedent from the game that flying off the table kills you, it potentially opens up the creativity to say that other things could leave too.
Yeah. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see the blast weapon type and the flyers are definitely two of the things that don't seem like such a big deal, but also have not had a lot of information leaked about them yet, or revealed about them yet. So I'm interested to see what more we find in the coming weeks. But that kind of does it for our list of 9, and we're definitely stretching long here. To wrap up, why don't we take a guess? I know I've got my opinion based on what they've said of when we can expect to see 9th edition coming out, but what are your thoughts?
Mid-June. Or sorry, not mid-June, mid-July.
Mid-July.
I think it's going to be mid-July. They, in the first thing, they said that it's a couple months off, and then they made it a point of saying this summer at another time, which could potentially be as far back as August or early September. But I just, for whatever reason, I think they are going to want to get back on the release schedule they had originally planned, because they have to recover from this COVID stuff like everybody else does.
Yep.
And we see coming up in the next week, the AdMech releases might have been a 2-week release cycle had the shutdown not happened. And so my guess is that from now until mid-July, we're going to see really aggressive new releases, and they're going to try to hit fourth quarter back on their original plan. Yeah. And so that's my personal guess. I think maybe it'll be August, but I think we're going to see it in mid-July, so that they can actually just get back on track and then finish the year out the way it was planned before COVID. That's my personal theory.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably pretty accurate. My thought, and this might be even a little more aggressive than they'll go, but I could see them saying, you know what, we want to get this pushed through. We want to get, you mentioned the quarter. They want to get it out as early in the quarter as possible. So we've got Engine War and all the AdMech stuff coming out on the 6th of June. So going up for pre-order on the 30th of May. Coming out on the 5th of June, going up for pre-order on the 30th of May. I would not be entirely surprised to see War of the Spider and Fabius Bile go up for pre-order on the 13th. They come out. Go up for pre-order on the 6th, and then see Pariah and the new Illuminor Xeris go up for pre-order on the 13th then. And then have them announce pre-orders for 9th edition on the 20th to have it launch the first week in July.
That may be true. I know with 8th edition, they did 2 weeks of pre-orders.
Right. That's why I'm thinking if they start the pre-order on the 20th, that would give them 2 weeks of pre-orders. The only thing I'm not sure about is that first Saturday in July that those pre-orders would go up is July 4th. So in the US, of course, that's a holiday. Sometimes they shift stuff around based on that. Sometimes they don't. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I would agree. I will be very surprised if we don't have 9th edition in our hands within the next 6 to 7 weeks.
Yeah, I think we'll probably see kind of like with 8th edition, week by week, we're going to see like, this is the new this phase. This is the new that phase. This is the new, terrain. Here's some examples of that. So if you look at how the game is traditionally laid out, if you're like, okay, there's a movement phase, a shooting phase, there's the charge phase and the fight phase, there's the morale phase, then you got terrain, and now you got new weapon types. That's 7 weeks.
Yep.
So now if they were to say vehicle changes is an 8th week, and maybe that talks about flyers and tanks and monsters or whatever, you're looking at 8 weeks. And so if they're going to do it like they did 8th edition, where they spotlight something every week on Warhammer Community, there's not much time before they're going to run out of things to spotlight.
Right. And I think this will be a very aggressive timeline, purely because of how many weeks of releases they lost to the the lockdowns for COVID and all that.
I think that everything that we would have seen split over 2 weeks is going to get crammed into 1 week. And I think that I don't know this for certain, but I think we may see like 1 or maybe 2 weeks of Age of Sigmar, but I don't think we're going to see much Age of Sigmar until 9th. Yeah, I think it is just going to be, they know, nothing against the fantasy lovers out there. I mean, I enjoy Age of Sigmar myself, but like they know where their bread is buttered, and they've got to make up for 2 months of business. So I have a feeling that 4th quarter might be where we see a lot of those like light elves and all that stuff that was previewed earlier in the year, and we're just going to get 40K crammed down our throat for the next 2 or 3 months.
Yep. And I think that kind of fits in with how they did things last year with the Age of Sigmar kind of 2nd edition revised, whatever they decided to call it, release. Well, that was last year, right? 2019.
I think so.
Yeah. Where we basically had 2 months of just Age of Sigmar releases and maybe like a one-off 40K character or special edition model or something. But it was almost all Age of Sigmar stuff coming out for Malign Portents and new stuff with that. So I think we'll probably see something similar this year.
I agree.
But either way, I will be absolutely shocked if we have not seen 9th edition out for play by the first week of August.
Yeah,
that would be surprising.
Agree with that.
Yeah. I don't know.
So
it'll be interesting.
I know we need to bring this to a close, but I'll ask you in one sentence.
Yeah.
Of just total wish listing, total speculation. What is one thing you would like to see changed in 9th edition that is not addressed in the in the release information?
Ooh, one thing they haven't talked about. Do you have something in mind?
Pistols. Just straight up, like a lot of the things I wanted to see in a revised edition were at least tangentially talked about. I want to see pistols either written more plainly, clarified, or just made better. Sure. I just think the being forced to shoot at the closest target and also being segregated from other firearms where it's pistols or non-pistols, and then you have to fire at the closest target. I think that is too restrictive for the benefit of being able to fire them in close combat. So I think that they need to simplify that and maybe loosen their hands on the reins with pistols. That's my wish list kind of thing, is that I want to see pistols able to fire into and out of close combat at any target that's within range. Because if you can't shoot anything else, if all you can do is draw your pistol, you should be able to shoot it at anybody within range.
Right. I agree. So one thing I think I'm not even sure what change I want to see at this point, but I would like to see something change in the way character targeting works. They're with all their announcements and everything, it seems to be they are working hard to remove those feels bad moments from the game. And one of the worst when it comes to especially teaching new players how to play is when you go, okay, here's my dude and here's my other guys, and they're going to go up and do that thing, and now it's your turn. And they go, okay, well, I'm going to shoot your Farseer. Okay, you can't. Why not? Because he's not the closest unit. He's the only thing I can see. Yeah, but there's a squad of Rangers on the other side of that wall that are invisible to you. I can't see anything else. Right. So I can't shoot with these guys? Nope.
It's not fun.
Like, it's just not fun, especially for people just learning the game. I mean, when I was teaching my wife how to play, she looks at me and goes, "That is one of the dumbest rules I have ever heard." And I went, "Yeah, you're not wrong." I mean, it's just, if there's a guy standing out in the open, it doesn't matter if you know there's a unit of scouts that are 3 millimeters closer. Shoot the guy you can see.
Yeah.
It
Well,
doesn't make sense not to.
Yeah, Smite handles it pretty well. You have to shoot the closest visible target.
Right.
And just you mentioning that character rule, that's another thing that really jams people up with pistols, is if the character is standing right there, like 6 inches away from you, here is like their army leader. And, I've got this person with like a melta pistol or whatever, like, oh no, nope, I can't shoot him. He's not the closest target. Well, who's the closest target? Well, the closest target is the, those rangers behind the wall. And you're like, really? So you're going to say that these two characters who are both like heroes of their respective factions standing 20 feet away from each other cannot have like a cowboy shootout,
right?
Because there's rangers on the other side of the wall,
right?
So, and I know that the character rule is really the one that's doing that. It's not the pistol rule, but just the fact that like pistols are so short ranged and they're so expensive and they're so cool that like the character rule even makes them suck even more.
Yeah. Well, and I think a great example of that is you can see that in the Raven Guard supplement or in the Raven Guard army, as someone who's working on a Raven Guard army, one of the weirdest things as I was looking through it was going, wow, there are multiple pistols that are either relics or pieces of war gear that that Shrike has, or whatever might be the case, that because they are pistols and they also have basically the sniper rule that they can target characters even if they're not the closest, like they might as well not be pistols anymore. They might as well just be assault weapons, because sure, okay, you can't shoot them when you advance, and if there's not a character nearby, you can't target something that's further away. But why do pistols have sniper rules, and why is it necessary for pistols to have sniper rules to make them do interesting things?
It's so I would agree. I think that's I think characters and pistols I think are good things to hope for.
So it'll be interesting to see.
So, we'll see. So we're hoping we were going to try to do some tactical discussions about other factions besides Sisters of Battle, but they kind of blindsided us with talking about a new edition. So
a little bit
kind of feels like maybe that's less useful now. So what we would like to do in some episodes that we're hoping to get up soon, we're going to talk about some broader game tactics, things that are not specific to factions. So we've kicked around the ideas of maybe doing a deployment conversation, or a pre-game discussion on what's smart as far as how many relics to buy, or things that are like kind of agnostic to the various factions. And if possible, I mean, I know stratagems are going to get weird, but also to have some discussions about things that are agnostic to system, kind of general game tactics, or we're forcing your opponent to make meaningful decisions, things that we've referred to in a lot of our conversations. So we're hoping to get you some videos about those kind of tactics, since may not be super useful to break down how an 8th edition codex works right now.
Yeah, exactly. So, and it is worth noting that the codexes, for the time being, are going to still be usable when 9th edition comes out, but because of how significantly parts of the system are going to be changing, it's too late in the cycle and too difficult to speculate accurately to put together a good tactical discussion of what might be good, what might not be good, that is still going to be relevant 2 months from now. So.
Exactly. But we want to make sure we bring you something that is relevant. So we're going to stick to kind of the bigger picture tactics that could really apply to any miniature war game. I mean, it's obviously going to be 40K centric from how we're coming at it, but just things like how to deploy smartly, how to maybe be organized, how to better show up ready to play so that you're not wasting time in little side actions or inefficient model positioning, or just things that might help you just be a better player in general. So you can look for that coming from us soon. And of course, we're going to be watching the Warhammer community site like hawks to come to you with conversations like this about any new information we learn about 9th edition.
Absolutely.
thanks for joining us. We know this went a little bit longer than we were planning, but there was a lot of good stuff to chew on. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely.